Today on the Free Marketeers, we're talking about all things investment and crypto. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Free Marketeers podcast. My name is Chris, and today I'm joined by the co-founder of Equity Kings, Tumisho Ramodisa. Tumisho, how are you doing? Thanks very much for being here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here and do a recording with the Free Market Foundation. I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, it's awesome to have you. We've been following each other on social media for a while, but I'm very glad that we get to now pick your brain, as it were. I mean, investment is obviously a big area of life, as it were, and I think it's important, especially in the South African context, that people have as much information as possible as to what avenues they could pursue for investment, and indeed how different things impact their investments, because investment isn't just, for example, the JSE. It could be, your house could be an investment, your home, having gold and silver, maybe cryptocurrency. So we're going to get into all of this stuff in the episode. I thought we'd start off with just on the macro global level. I think this is something that you could definitely help us understand a bit. Over the last year or so, obviously with COVID, a lot of economies have been in lockdown, so demand maybe hasn't been what it was before. Now that economies are opening up, people are spending more. Do you think we're going to run into the issues of high inflation soon? I mean, some economies, for example, the US, they're just printing money now.
First of all, with the money printing thing, there's no money that's actually being printed. It's just bank reserves. So what happens in the US, you have the Fed, the central bank. So what they do is they buy US treasuries. That's what quantitative easing is. They buy US treasuries from these primary dealer banks. And then these primary dealer banks get bank reserves. So the Fed just basically credits their account because banks have an account with the Fed. So they have more bank reserves. And then the whole theory of money printing comes into play when you say these guys the government has to go on auction and auction out these government treasuries so they can fund stimulus, infrastructure, and all these things that we're hearing. So the banks are apparently buying it with bank reserves. So there's still an argument going on there whether banks are using bank reserves to buy treasuries to fund government stimulus or not. But if that is the case, then you could call it money printing, but there's no actual money printing going on there. So how I see inflation is I'm on both sides. I think there might be deflation and I also think there might be inflation, depending on whether government stimulus persists over the long term. So this inflation argument that we've been hearing is, government has been giving stimulus, therefore prices have to go up, because by definition, inflation is an expansion of the money supply when the quantity of money increases, and the results of that is higher prices. That is what inflation is. So people are saying that because of the expansion of the money supply that we saw in April, I think it was March 2020, we saw the government do some massive stimulus all around the world, not just in the US, all around the world. In South Africa, our Reserve Bank didn't want to call it quantitative easing, but then he just basically bought a bunch of government bonds around March and April. So it's still quantitative easing, but regardless, what's happening is people are saying that all of this is inflationary. And over the past few months, we've been seeing CPI prints going from, I think it started off at 1%. I think it bottomed at 0.5%, and then it started increasing gradually. And right now we have 5.4% inflation in the US. And people are saying, this is what we've been waiting for. This is the inflation we've been waiting for. But as I say, it's not that simple. There's so many cross currents at play that you can't just possibly tell me that because government did stimulus, it's highly inflationary and that's the only thing that's happening. Yeah, that's my take on it.
A little bit on the South African government and treasury, just to get your thoughts on that. So, the last maybe 5 occasions, I think the Reserve Bank has kept the repo rate the same. So what does that tell you about our Reserve Bank? I mean, you can talk about the Treasury as well, but what do you think about the Reserve Bank as an institution? Where are they looking at? Is it too simple to say they're very Keynesian, very Austrian? How do we make sense of their policy direction, as it were?
Yeah, I think in my own opinion, I think what they did was a very big mistake, dropping the rates down. Because think about how it is. Austrian economics like von Mises and Hayek, They said when an economy goes into a depression, that means less goods and services is being produced.
Right.
You don't want to have more money chasing less goods and services. You want to tighten policy and shrink the money supply when there's a recession. You don't want to increase the money supply. And we saw the opposite. We saw our Reserve Bank. I don't think our money supply increased that much, but we obviously dropped rates to 3.5% if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure when they're going to tighten policy, but that's basically it had this psychological effect whereby they drop rates and then the stock market just goes up thereafter. And that's what we saw with the JSE. The JSE went up dramatically in April. It was almost a quick recovery. You might even think it was a straight line. But people might say that, okay, this low interest rate makes stock prices go up, but it's all psychology. It's not that they actually pump money in the system. Because if you look at the IMF papers, the IMF printed these other papers. I think it was their working papers in 2014, and they specifically spoke about bank reserves. So they said bank reserves cannot be used to purchase financial or non-financial products. The only thing bank reserves can be used to purchase is government bonds. Nothing else except for government bonds. I think that's where the exception is. So to say that quantitative easing, low interest rate policy, it increases stock prices, that's rubbish. The only reason why it increased is because of the psychological effects of it. So they play this psychological game, whereas nothing's actually going on here. Yeah.
I mean, to make it very basic, but in a way, I like to think that economics itself should be relatively easily understandable and basic. A currency itself is a matter of psychology and trust, of course. I mean, me giving a rand to the shop when I buy something is them also trusting that the money has this sort of shared value and trust, as it were, between people. So the reason I mention that is just to lead you to the next point, which is around different stores of value, as it were, and specifically crypto, which is all the vogue now. I mean, even governments, I've read in some publications that the European Bank, for example, the European Union Bank, might look at starting their own cryptocurrency. I mean, thinking about government doing crypto, it feels like it goes against the very nature of crypto. But what do you think of crypto broadly? I mean, you can speak about stuff like Bitcoin specifically, but do you think that has potential in South Africa?
Yeah, I think it does have potential. I'm not a big Bitcoin fan. For those who follow me, they'll know that I don't like Bitcoin because I don't think it can function as money, because Bitcoin is trying to dethrone the dollar and all these fiat currencies. And they're saying one day we're going to use Bitcoin because it has a capped rate, or it has a capped supply at 21 million Satoshis or 21 million Bitcoins. That's what they call it. But really, in my opinion, I don't think that's going to happen because, first of all, people are into Bitcoin for the wrong reasons. People think that Bitcoin is a way to hedge against inflation and to dethrone the dollar, whereas that's not the case. If you look at El Salvador, the first country to make Bitcoin legal tender, they did it around May or June, if I'm not mistaken, this year, just a few months ago. So when El Salvador did that, all these Bitcoin guys are saying, oh, this is a celebration. We are so happy. This is what we've been preaching all this time. All these Bitcoin prophets have been preaching this thing, and it's finally happening, except it's not happening for the reasons that they think it is. What's happening is El Salvador has a shortage of dollars. There's a global dollar shortage. And since El Salvador dollarized the economy in the late 90s or 2000, if to be specific, when they dollarized the economy and they started using dollars as medium of exchange, as legal tender, what happened was they were trying to get on the euro dollar boom, because euro dollar is just an alternative to the dollar. It's a global money. I don't know how to explain it, but it's basically what happens is you have this shortage in dollars globally. So the US can't provide enough dollars globally. So they need euro dollars. So all these foreign central banks and all these foreign players, what they do is they have dollar denominated deposits, and then they create loans with those deposits. That's the euro dollar. So it's trying to create elasticity, money elasticity. That's the purpose of euro dollar. And it's in the shadows. It's a decentralized kind of money. It's a ledger money that's in the shadows. The same thing as Bitcoin. So euro dollar is trying to solve a problem of a shortage of dollars. And that's exactly why El Salvador went into Bitcoin is to solve a shortage of dollars. Because if you check what happened in March, they asked the IMF for 1 billion. Remember, $1 billion is a lot of money for a small country like El Salvador. It's a lot of money. So they asked for that 1 billion. They didn't get it. And then the foreign exchange reserves went down. I think it got slashed in half. And so they knew that they were in trouble. And the only way to get those dollars was to go to Bitcoin as the solution. So they needed more money or more liquidity, and Bitcoin was the solution for that. And it's a solution for many, many countries that have a shortage of dollars, as we've seen post 2008. So the whole Bitcoin thing about inflation and we're gonna dethrone the dollar, it doesn't make sense, because when you get into the nuts and bolts of these things, you realize that Bitcoin is not there to solve a problem of too much money. It's there to solve a problem of too little money in the system. And you can even go back to the 1950s, the dollar shortage of the 1950s. This whole idea of ledger money, because that's what Bitcoin is. It's on a blockchain, and it's a ledger between you and the person who you're transferring your Bitcoins to. That's all it is. It's ledger money. This thing goes back to the 15th century during the bullion famine, if I'm not mistaken. The bullion famine, there was a shortage of gold, because back at those days, gold was money. So there was a shortage of gold. And therefore, since there was a shortage of gold, the way to solve it is to create some ledger money. Therefore, you have more money in the system, but it's not actually gold. It's another form of money that's decentralized. So that's what we're seeing with Bitcoin and El Salvador, and currently Uruguay, because Uruguay is almost getting into Bitcoin as legal tender. So we're seeing the same things around Central American countries and maybe South American countries, and we might see that thing happen globally. So Bitcoin might attract demand, just not for the reasons people are going into Bitcoin for. So in South Africa, maybe if we get into the same problems where we have a shortage of dollars, because the dollar is the reserve currency, we get into a shortage of dollars, we're going to need something to offset that shortage. And that's going to be Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. Yeah.
I mean, this is me asking you maybe a difficult question and a broad question, so you can decide how to dodge it or not, or how to handle it or not. But asking you to predict the future, as it were, do you see, for example, the Rand just continually losing value and then people shifting onto, I don't know, like a different dollar or some crypto? Do you think the Rand is just going to continue being devalued?
Yeah, I think the Rand's days are numbered, in my opinion.
Okay.
I mean, we've known this since the 2000s. I mean, I was a baby during the early 2000s, as you can see, I'm young. But the Rand itself is so fragile, and things the way I see this country going in the future, I don't think the Rand will survive. I think maybe I don't think the Rand will survive, but I don't think people will move to Bitcoin as a solution. Like, people won't be using Bitcoin because it's inefficient, to say the least, because Bitcoin is so volatile. It's extremely volatile. I mean, you can't price your products in Bitcoin, because the next day the value might just go down 20%. Or it can go up 30%. I mean, it's so volatile that you'd have to constantly change prices. And also, the transaction fees are extremely high. I mean, some people might argue that those transaction fees can go down because of the hashes. But then again, it's untrustworthy. I don't know how to explain it, but Bitcoin, I don't think it could work, or any cryptocurrency for that matter. Maybe if it was a cryptocurrency backed by gold, then maybe would have some potential there. That's worth discussing. But besides that, I don't see cryptocurrencies as a medium of exchange. I only see it as a way to invest over the long term. I mean, if you're bullish on Bitcoin long term, meaning that you think Bitcoin's going to go up in the future, then yeah, you can buy Bitcoin. But as money, I don't think Bitcoin is a good function of money. I don't think it operates well as money. Neither does all these cryptocurrencies, Dogecoin. I mean, there's 10,000 cryptocurrencies. So to say that Bitcoin is the superior one, there's a lot of competition in crypto. So when you look at it from the standpoint of investing and maybe short-term trading, yeah, sure, get into Bitcoin. It's fine. But money-wise, I don't think that's what's happening with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin in and of itself has no utility as money. It cannot operate as money. No one uses Bitcoin to buy pizza. If I go to the pizza shop, if I go to Debonair's or Romans, I mean, they're not going to accept Bitcoin. The only way they'll accept Bitcoin is if they price it in rands. So Bitcoin against the rand. So you need something else, you see, in order to use Bitcoin. But when you get to a society where it's just Bitcoin, there's nothing else, it's Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, that won't work, in my opinion. It can't work.
So with the direction in which South Africa is going, and I mean, everyone who follows the FMF knows all the work that we do, and I'm sure all of your listeners know also your views on the country, on the various ways in which the government is trying to control our lives, and in so doing, negatively affecting the value of the currency, also negatively affecting, for example, what people can use their money for. I mean, people always, I think, generally tend to forget, higher inflation means that someone who's poor, lower to middle income, means their money doesn't go as far as it used to. So basic staples like bread and milk cost a lot more to them than it did before, and it pinches them quite hard. For wealthier people, I mean, they can go wherever they want pretty much to buy what they want. So I want to ask you, how does one protect one's assets and one's value against what the government is doing? How do you make it state-proof, as it were? That idea of state-proofing yourself, your family, your community. Is there one answer? Are there many answers? What do you think of that concept?
Yeah, I think there's many answers, but one thing I think everyone should own is gold or silver, because think about what gold and silver does. People say gold and silver is an inflation hedge. So that's a myth. Gold and silver isn't an inflation hedge, it's an error hedge. And this is what Jeff Snyder always says. So the whole idea behind it is people think that gold performs only when there's inflation. It also performs well when there's deflation. You look at in 2008, during the financial crisis, gold performed in a deflationary environment. Gold performed because the market realized that this was a monetary error. And in the 1970s, during the Great Inflation, what happened to gold? Gold went up. Gold performed well because it wasn't an inflationary problem per se, but a monetary error. So gold is a monetary error. So whatever error you might have, whether it's inflationary, deflationary, disinflationary, whatever terms they are for that, whatever happens, gold will always hold its purchasing power, and silver. So the way I see South Africa going, I don't think it's going to go well for South Africa. I mean, Free Market Foundation has clearly stated that there's a lot of things going on in South Africa. There's a lot of problems. I mean, government gets bigger, because the bigger the government gets, the lower economic growth we get. So I don't think that there's any savior in politics, because politics is a dirty game. I mean, politics is basically, you just have to promise voters the most free things. That's all politics is. Whoever can promise the most free things is the one that gets the vote. I mean, look in America, Biden is promising the most free things. That's why he's president. I mean, had it not been him providing these free things, quote unquote free things, because nothing's for free, but had it not been for that ideology, we wouldn't see Biden winning. We wouldn't see any of these people winning. But the thing is, people don't understand that there's nothing for free. There is nothing for free at all. You can't, someone has to pay for it, either through taxes or through inflation. Someone has to pay for it. And that's the same thing we're seeing in South Africa. I mean, I don't want to go off a tangent, but there's these things going on in South Africa with students protesting fees must fall, as if education can ever be free, because there's no such thing as free things. You look at people protesting for free healthcare. Oh, NHI, and you've pointed this out in your tweets. NHI, these things, come on. You can't get these things for free. You're going to have to pay for it. And these things is what led to the demise of the Soviet Union, Cuba, all these communist countries. So I don't see South Africa ever changing its ways or something like that, unless government shrinks its size. That's the key point. Government shrinks its size. Yeah.
That's the dream, and that's part of what we work towards. Hopefully, at some point, maybe reality in some ways will hit home for government. I mean, one wonders, in other ways, they just seem convinced by their ideology, and they're going to keep doing what they keep doing regardless. And we're going to look back on a 42% unemployment rate in a few years and say, oh, that was low, like a 74% youth unemployment rate. Oh, that's comparatively low. We hope that won't be the case, obviously, and that's why we do the work that we do. I wanted to ask you also sort of a defined topic or a question, as it were, just about offshore investing, because that's also a big sort of in vogue thing now, a big buzzword in South Africa, especially, again, with the damage that the government is doing. Not to put you on the spot and say, oh, where should I invest? Should I invest in the US or just in the UK kind of thing? But what do you think of the concept of offshore investing?
Yeah, I think what you want to do is get out of South Africa in terms of investing, because South Africa, you have a lot of risk. You have a lot of counterparty risk, especially because imagine buying property like real estate in South Africa. You want to have a real estate portfolio in South Africa. I mean, there's these protests going on for expropriation of land without compensation. Why on earth would someone want to invest in property knowing that property rights are on the edges? So you don't want to own property in South Africa. I maybe you want to own stocks in South Africa because the central bank is just going to keep fooling everyone into pumping up the stock market. So maybe you want to own stocks, but offshore, I think you want to own a lot of companies that have good paying dividends, that have good balance sheets, that actually make a profit, because that's something rare these days, because there's many companies that are basically broke, and the only way they still stay alive is because of central bank policy and this artificial low interest rate policy. Because if you have low interest rates, you can take on as much debt, and that's why the whole economy has so much debt. The global debt is staggering. So you don't want to be anywhere in South Africa in terms of investing. Maybe you want to invest in commodities in South Africa, but that's all I got for you. But offshore, you want to invest in other emerging markets like Asia and things like that, like Singapore. I heard there's good paying dividend stocks in Singapore. You want to own some stocks there. You also want to get away from these growth stocks and go into value. You want to own these things that actually have value, like gold and silver, as I mentioned before. The one thing you have to own is gold and silver, in my opinion. Yeah.
No, I think that's pretty solid advice. The more the world goes in this direction of, well, one is worried about the direction, but the more it makes sense to just be as diversified as possible, as it were. I wanted to ask you just about advice for people who, I mean, might not have an asset portfolio and a share portfolio of hundreds of millions of rands. What about for people who are on the sort of lower to middle income end of income of the spectrum? What options do they have? Is it the case of looking at the JSE, for example, looking at some companies which are better than others? Do you just have to start somewhere and start diversifying, maybe not just having your money in pensions that are controlled by the government, for example? Just that idea of how do you, even if you've only got 100 Rand to play with, where do you go, as it were? I mean, they could talk to you, they could talk to equity kings, for example. Where do they go?
Like if you have like a few hundred rands, you can go on easy equities. I mean, easy equities, you can buy stocks there, you can buy South African stocks and maybe a couple of American stocks there. So you can start small and just build up on that. You can just start small and build up on that. But on the point of if you have little money, where do you want to go besides easy equities? You can check things like REITs and all these kind of funds, but these funds that only require little money. You know, there's these funds like I forgot the name of the fund, but there are certain funds that have small requirements, like minimal requirements, and you can go into those funds and just keep building up on that and keep saving. And as you save, you invest more. So with government pension funds, those things are doomed. It's basically a Ponzi scheme, because the way it works is, we all know governments run a huge budget deficit. So government, in order to cover that deficit, they have to borrow money. So that by definition is a Ponzi scheme. Because if you don't have money, if you don't collect any money, because taxes is the government's income. So if you're spending more than you earn and you have to borrow the rest, where are you going to pay the borrowers? Where are you going to pay the borrowers? Where are you going to get the money? So the government has to borrow. So the government has to, for example, let's say the government wants to, I want to borrow the government money. I buy government bonds, right? And then how is the government going to pay me? They have to borrow from you, Chris. And that's a Ponzi scheme. By definition, that is a Ponzi scheme. So those things are doomed in my opinion, and I don't like the word doomed, but that's what it is. So government pension funds, it's not something that I like. You just wanna get away from that and just step aside from that and don't listen to the mainstream BS and just do what you have to do. Yeah. And just to go off topic a bit and just go back to my inflation topic, the thing that I was talking about, inflation, the reason why I don't see persistent inflation is because I spoke about the global dollar shortage. And because there's a global dollar shortage, what has to happen is you find yields on the government 10-year treasury. It's government debt, government bonds for those who don't know treasuries. So March, April, we saw yields going down, which is telling us, the market is telling us, the global market, not just the domestic US market, the global market is telling us that, hey, we see deflationary potentials, because when there's inflation, yields or interest rates go up. And when there's deflation, interest rates go down. And that's what's been going on in the yield with the 10-year yield. Yields have been going down. At the same time, reverse repos with the Federal Reserve has been going up, which means that all these bank reserves that were created in 2020 are getting squeezed into reverse repo. So basically they're shrinking and they're going into reverse repo, because that's how it works with the balance sheet. And what that is, it means if banks have less bank reserves, they have less lending capacity, because banks are the ones responsible for creating money. So if banks have less lending capacity, what has to happen is what happens is there is less loans in the system, and therefore that is deflationary. The money supply goes down. So we're seeing all these deflationary forces. The bond market is telling us that we don't believe in this inflation story, so yields go down. And that's what's happening. There's a scramble for government collateral, and the only way to solve that problem, that deflationary problem, is if government does another round of stimulus, maybe a $5 trillion stimulus plan. Who knows how crazy they are, but that's the only way to solve it. But it's a temporary solution, because that problem is going to come back again in the future when government stops doing, because government, they have to go through Congress and things like that, and it takes time to pass these stimulus bills. So while it's taking time, it's depriving the market of the collateral it needs. Therefore, that is deflationary, because there's less collateral in the system. So inflation, I don't see inflation happening. I think we'll see more disinflation or deflation, but unless the government does another round of stimulus, because they haven't been doing stimulus since March. So, and the problem is, these people who call for inflation, they just look at the US economy as a domestic economy. They don't look at it globally, because the dollar is a global reserve currency. So if there's a global dollar shortage, but in the US, the money supply is going up, but in the real world, in the outside world, the money supply is going down because of euro dollars are going down, what happens is that on net balance, there's a global dollar shortage, and that can't be inflationary. At the very least, it has to be deflationary, because there's less money in the system. So I can show you many charts if I could share my screen, but I can't. But that's basically what's happening. There is a dollar shortage, and the only way, I don't think central banks can really create money out of thin air, as people always say. They only create bank reserves, and that's not enough, because bank reserves are trapped in the system. And the only way for them to go out of the system is if government does stimulus and the banks buy it with these new bank reserves that the central bank creates. So that's what I think of this inflation deflation story. I think we'll have deflation because the system's inherently deflation. And another thing is, there's huge debt in the system. So debt is also deflationary, because you're trying to deleverage. So when you're trying to deleverage, that is deflationary, because leverage increases the amount of money, and then deflation is basically when you're deleveraging and then there's less money in the system. So the market is trying to deleverage, but the government is countering that with more quote unquote inflation. So the way I see it playing out, I don't think we could have this sustained inflation. And I don't think crypto is the solution for that if we had sustained inflation. So once these crypto guys realize that there's no inflation, what's going to happen? I mean, that destroys the whole argument of crypto. It means there's no demand for crypto, because the only reason why people want crypto is because they think the dollar is going to lose value. Well, what happens when it doesn't lose value? You see?
Okay, that was really useful. It helps me like clarify my own thinking around this stuff as well. As a final question, if we had the power, because, we control capital in South Africa and all that kind of stuff, to put you in the position of Minister of Finance tomorrow, or, head of Treasury, head of the Reserve Bank, a Reserve Bank governor, any of those positions, if we could do that tomorrow, what's the first one or two things that you would enact in terms of policy that you think would set things on a better path?
The first thing I would do is deregulate the banking system. If I was the governor of the Reserve Bank or the Treasury or finance minister, I'll deregulate, because there's so much regulation in the banking system. It's no surprise that we only have a few big banks in the system. So when you deleverage, it means, or not deleverage, sorry, when you deregulate, it means that now these small banks, these guys that want to start, can actually have a good footing in starting their banks, because there's so much money, there's so much costs that come with regulations. So you want to deregulate so you can get more economic growth. So I think the first step is to deregulate. But the problem is, it's not politically viable to deregulate, because apparently when you regulate something, you're trying to protect people, whereas history shows that that's not the case. It's actually doing more harm than good. So
I think you're protecting the big players. You're protecting the entrenched interest from competition.
And they love it, exactly. And they love this thing. These big guys, they love all this regulation. In fact, they even lobby for more regulation so that they can keep the small boys out of it. But then in a free market capitalism, you need more competition, therefore creating more jobs and more prosperity for everyone. So that's what you need. You need deregulation. You need government to get out of the way. You need deregulation everywhere. If I was president, you'd want to deregulate healthcare so that healthcare can become cheaper, because when you regulate it, it becomes more expensive. It's economics 101. It's economics 101. You regulate something, or you put price controls or all these other things that Friedrich Hayek was talking about. You basically make things more expensive in that aspect. So you don't want to do that. You want to free up the economy so you can create more employment and more jobs. And also, you want to get rid of something very controversial, BBBEE. You want to get rid of that as well, because that's not doing anything for Black people. It's doing more harm than good. So you just want to get government out of the way. And some people might say, Tumisho, but the government has helped us. The government has helped us. The government says they're going to give me money. They're going to give me a basic income. The government this and this and that. And I always hear these things, but I tell you, you don't want the government to solve your problems. You have to solve the problems for yourself. And the government is in the way. The government is an impediment to economic growth. So you want the government out of the way, and then you want free market capitalism to actually work properly. You don't want government constraining free market capitalism, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think given South Africa's long history of oppression and state abuse of especially Black South Africans, I very much worry when people advocate for policies that increase people's dependence on the state, because any state that has the power to give you everything has the power to take it all away. And
exactly,
things get bad. And it's not just, I don't think it should be a case of just the current party in power or the current government. I don't think any government should have the kind of power that our current government has. It doesn't matter if it's the blue team or the red team or the yellow team. That's basically what I think. I wanted to give you the final word. Any sort of pearls of wisdom, any insights? We're going to have you on more in the future, because there's a lot in finance and economics to unpack, so you don't have to cover everything now, but just any final words, and also just include where people can find you. I'll leave your links in the description below, but just tell people as well.
Yeah, and my final words to the listeners of Free Market Foundation is, you need to be independent as a person. You can't be relying on the government. We've seen massive evidence that points to when you have more government, you have less economic growth. And some people might even point to Sweden and say, hey, that's a socialism paradise. No, Sweden is not really socialism. It's not really a socialist state. It is socialist in terms of healthcare and all these things. But don't forget, Sweden pays high taxes. People pay a lot of taxes. I think the average tax rate is 50-something%, if I'm not mistaken. Sweden pays a lot of taxes. People pay a lot of taxes. So if you want all these free things, things, you're going to have to pay a lot higher taxes, and you're not going to get the best quality. When government produces something, it produces it inefficient because government has no profit motive. A business has a profit motive. So in order for the business to make a profit, he has to satisfy your needs. But the government doesn't have a profit motive. It just gives people things for free. So it doesn't have to pay for the costs of running these things. It can just make it free, but not pay for the costs. You look at the UK where there's free education and free healthcare. Healthcare is bad in the UK. It's public healthcare is bad in the UK. You look at the same thing in Sweden, which I was just talking about now. The education in Sweden is bad. Sometimes with the healthcare in Sweden, people wait in long lines. So you look at all these things and you realize that why do people still want free things? People always want free things as if anything is ever free, because nothing is free. And when it becomes quote unquote free, you're going to have to pay for it with either taxes or inflation. And on top of that, you're going to pay for it with lower quality. So the free market, it's basic common sense. You look at schools in South Africa, which schools are better, private schools or public schools? It's a no-brainer. It's obviously private schools, not because private schools are somehow evil capitalists. No, it's because they have a profit system. And that profit system helps people grow and helps people become better and better. And that's what we need. That's so my advice is think for yourself, use critical thinking. Don't just look at government things and say, hey, this is actually true. Oh, I was a black person. My parents struggled and all these things. Yeah, our parents did struggle, but you have to look behind that and look to the future. And the future saying you can be successful. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter the color of your skin, wherever you come from. You can still be successful. You just have to get government out of the way, because government is the one preventing you from succeeding. So you want government out of the way and you want free market capitalism. So it's easier for you to start a business. It's easier for you to hire workers, and therefore you can prosper in society. So you guys can follow me on Instagram at Nature Boy. You can follow me on Instagram, same username. I have a podcast called The Wild Show with Equity Kings that I do with my good buddy Siyabonga Chuma. You guys can listen to our podcast. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
Perfect. I think that's a great note on which to end. I will leave all those links in the description of this video. So I encourage everyone to go and follow Equity Kings. Make sure that you get their insights and their advice in terms of how to take charge of your life and quote unquote make yourself state proof. It's up to each of us to look after ourselves, our families, our communities. I think we're seeing that more and more, and hopefully when we get more voices and more information out there, people will be able to do that a lot more easier and with a lot more future proofing and state proofing, as it were. So Tumisho, thank you very much for your time today. Listeners, I hope that you all enjoyed this. We will definitely have you back on the show. Keep an eye out for more episodes coming in coming weeks. And if you haven't yet, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click on the big red button underneath this video. And also you can, just as a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts in audio format on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, everywhere else. Just search Free Marketeers. Thanks for your time. I hope you all have a good week going forward. We'll talk to you all again very soon. Until next time, take care.